Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Yes, sorry about the technical difficulties, but it looks like the link is working now. So just as people are coming in, just wanted to thank all of you for joining us in this webinar, and just wanted to say today's webinar is provided by Let's Face Change, and then also in partnership with Middlesex University and Greater Manchester Mental Health. The focus of these webinars are for us to think about what mental health practitioners can do about racism within sort of the context of different mental health services. And our ethos as Let's Face Change is sort of to encourage conversations about exploring and tackling the lack of diversity in clinical psychology, but also the racial inequalities in mental health services. And we want these webinars to be an opportunity to keep these conversations going, explore new ideas, and build momentum for our next conference, which will be in November later this year, but we haven't announced that yet. Also, our values are around the fact that with things like this, there's always a fear of getting it wrong, but we want this to be a space that honors those difficult conversations and those feelings that may arise. And we want to honor the different viewpoints that come with that. And so we kind of think about it in the way that there's no one right way to see the world or talk about these issues, but just to have a bit of a space where we can explore them together. And so trying to respect different perspectives. Rufus?
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, it's great to be here. This is, I think, our fourth webinar. And yeah, I'm really excited for this one. I heard about Bianca's research and I thought it was quite unusual, and there needs to probably be more research in looking at supervision and how we might create more space to think about race and culture. So I'm really excited to look at this topic. Bianca's going to speak for about 30 to 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And please use the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A mode for that. And we might open it up to audio as well, that people can ask questions towards the end. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Bianca. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Rufus. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Right, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about my research, which looked at exploring the supervisory relationship in the context of culturally responsive supervision. So just in terms of the overview of today's session, we're going to be talking a little bit about what culturally responsive supervision is and what it isn't. I'll be talking a little bit about supervision literature and why we need to make space for cultural discussions in supervision. I'll then be sharing the research findings from my doctoral research and some of the implications of these findings. And finally, I'll be inviting everybody to kind of share their own reflections about how we move towards developing culturally responsive supervisory practices. I've put this little picture on this slide just because I just wanted to kind of be mindful of the fact that whilst we're talking about responsive supervision, it may bring up memories for some people of their own supervision and sometimes kind of instances of culturally unresponsive supervision. So I just thought it was important that we're all kind of mindful and we do kind of make sure that we're looking after ourselves during this. So I wanted to start with a bit of the introduction into my journey into clinical psychology. So I was born and raised in Northwest London, and my cultural identity has been influenced by North Indian, Kenyan, and British cultures. I grew up in a part of London where I really hadn't experienced being that much of a ethnic minority, just because there was just so many rich kind of cultural influences around me. So I had quite a shock when I then decided to start clinical training outside of London. And I guess kind of going into clinical psychology was already quite a different path for me compared to other people in my family. And I think, even to this day, I'm still trying to explain to family members how I'm a doctor that doesn't prescribe medication. But I really thought that would be quite different when I then started training. However, when I did start training, on my very first day, I did look around and I found that I was the only person of color in my cohort. And within our program team, there was only one other staff member who was also a person of color. So actually navigating that journey throughout training was actually quite difficult and quite isolating for me. I know that I definitely wanted a space to reflect more on my cultural identity and think more about my personal and professional development. But often I found that this space wasn't always available for me, particularly in the way that I wanted it to be. So after kind of experiencing a few culturally unresponsive experiences, particularly on placements and within clinical supervision, it led me to think more about research in this area and how to kind of start thinking differently about some of these things. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about clinical supervision, which can be really difficult to define just because there are so many different definitions that exist within the literature. So generally, we can understand clinical supervision as a formal provision of a relationship-based education between a supervisee and usually a much senior supervisor. Obviously, this looks different depending on the profession you're in, but within clinical psychology, often supervisors have, kind of main roles that they play. So this might include helping supervisees to learn new skills and build their knowledge, whilst integrating this into clinical practice. Supervisors also play an important role in ensuring and evaluating safe and effective clinical practice, hopefully, helping supervisees to think more about their clients and think about how they improve client outcomes. Supervisors provide supervisees with emotional support and encouragement in relation to their clinical work. And the aim is also to develop a supervisory relationship that facilitates safety and personal growth for clinicians. So in the UK, clinical supervision is mandatory for trainee and qualified therapists. However, we find that supervision literature often is under-researched, and a lot of the literature has come out of places such as America, with there being very few studies looking at supervision within the UK. So time and time again, existing research consistently highlights the importance of the quality of the supervisory relationship. And it shows us that again and again, it's this supervisory relationship that is key to supervisory outcomes and success. And that's regardless of the supervision model that's adopted. So the supervisory relationship is the most significant predictor of supervisee satisfaction within supervision. And it often creates a holding environment for supervisees' professional and personal development. So research tells us that when it comes to the formation and maintenance of a high quality supervisory relationship, the factors that are really important are the rapport between the supervisor and supervisee, supportive experiences, collaboration between the two parties, and often attachment patterns can really come into play here too. So why do we need cultural competence? So if we think about culture, it's often used as a bit of an umbrella term, and it can be conceptualized by lots of different multiple kind of contextual variables. With regards to this research in particular, we looked specifically at race and ethnicity. But I really wanted to kind of just highlight the fact that culture can influence our individual worldviews, our belief systems, and our values. And it can really shape how problems are perceived and interpreted by clients, clinicians, and services. I think this iceberg diagram is just a great way of just capturing the nuances of culture. Obviously, we kind of see surface level culture, which may be kind of, in your face in terms of kind of food, different music, different languages, festivals and holidays. But underneath that, when we look a little bit deeper, we can see how culture really impacts so many different things, such as communication styles and rules, our rules and notions of friendship, leadership, our attitudes towards authority, towards rules, workplace rules, our approaches to religion, marriage, decision making, problem solving. And so we see that there are, just so many parts that work together when we're thinking about culture, and it's actually so much deeper than what you see at the surface. We know that issues of difference and other social inequalities are becoming more and more prevalent in the field of healthcare. And we also know that many psychological models and treatment to date has been criticized for being Eurocentric or westernized and focusing a bit too much on individual change, which can sometimes mean that it might be less effective for those with collectivist values, where the construction of the self is different to the Western construct of self. If we think about defining cultural competence, it can be defined as a practitioner's acquisition of cultural awareness, knowledge, and skills required to provide effective and responsive treatment for all cultural groups. So when we're thinking about cultural responsiveness in clinical supervision, I think the first place we need to kind of start is understanding that clinical supervision, like other social contexts, is not immune from racism and hierarchies of social power and privilege. And if this isn't acknowledged, it can negatively affect the supervisory relationship and clinical work. Culturally responsive supervision assumes that practitioners bring their cultural backgrounds and experiences into supervision with them, and these permeate into their clinical practice and the supervision space. Culturally responsive supervisors promote the development of cultural competence in supervision, and they do this through responsivity, through reflective discussion. So, for example, discussions around power and privilege. And they also do this by modeling their own cultural competence. Supervision can also be a space to reflect on your cultural identity development and the impact that this can have on your work. So when thinking about culturally responsive supervision, sometimes it's helpful to think about culturally unresponsive supervision and what this could look like. So there's lots in the literature about this, but like I said, that's predominantly originating from America. But often in the research, researchers talk about cultural issues being ignored in supervision, being minimized or dismissed by supervisors. And sometimes supervisors might make unhelpful comparisons. Culturally unresponsive supervision can also include the presence of inappropriate or derogatory language, the presence and maintenance of microaggressions. It can include culture being spoken about in a superficial way, where the exploration really lacks depth, or it feels a bit like a tick box exercise. It can include invalidating the realities and lived experiences faced by minoritized individuals, which we know can negatively impact the supervisee, the relationship, and client outcomes. If we think about what might play a role in keeping unresponsive practices going, there are lots of different factors that we can consider. So one of the factors in the UK is that we know that most clinical supervisors are predominantly from a white background. Some white supervisors might be minimally aware of their own cultural influences, biases, and potential role in denigrating racially or ethnically minoritized groups. And a lot of the time in the research, there are references to the fact that actually white is a color too, and culture and ethnicity and otherness are things that everybody has. So culture shouldn't just be reserved for racially or ethnically minoritized groups. Often we talk about the fact that supervision needs to have an examination of the invisible aspect of whiteness, where time is spent really unpacking the entitlements and norms associated with being white. We also understand that some supervisors can feel uncomfortable and lack confidence in broaching cultural issues in supervision. And this might be due to a lack of appropriate training, a lack of experience, the fear and anxiety of getting things wrong, or even a lack of awareness of their own cultural identity and how to explore this further. Additionally, the consideration of culture in supervision is often lacking. And we often know that with traditional supervision models, cultural variables are often not mentioned. Previous research also highlights that minoritized supervisees can often perceive their supervisor's discomfort and avoidance in addressing racial or cultural concerns, and see this as culturally unresponsive. Often the research talks about the fact that when this happens, supervisees might perceive this as being related to their supervisor's inability to admit their lack of knowledge and expertise in this area. It can also negatively impact the supervisory relationship if supervisees don't feel safe enough to discuss their own cultural identity, or if they feel that their supervisor isn't interested in learning more about their cultural identity. So I'm just going to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour of my research. So what we wanted to look at was supervisees' perspectives of culturally responsive supervision within the UK. And we wanted to look at differences between cross-cultural and culturally similar supervisory dyads. So we started by creating an online survey, and we sent this to lots of professionals and trainees across the UK. So we sent that to trainee or qualified clinical psychologists, counselling psychologists, or CBT therapists. We had quite a good turnout. So we had 222 people who completed this survey. And the measures that we sent out included a demographic form where we asked supervisees about their cultural identity. We then asked them to tell us the cultural identity of their supervisor. We also included a short supervisory relationship scale, and we included the race and ethnicity supervision scale. This was a scale that had been developed in America, specifically trying to measure cultural responsivity within supervision. So after we kind of got all of those responses back, we looked at putting supervisees into different groups. So if a white supervisee told us that they had a white supervisor, we put them into a particular group. If the white supervisee had a supervisor who was from a racially or ethnically minoritized background, we put them in a different group. And you can see here on the right that we've got 4 different groups that we kind of separated the data into. I think it's important to mention that, as you can see, white supervisees who had white supervisors were the majority of our participants. And there were very few supervisees in the white supervisee to racially ethnically minoritized supervisor group, and racially ethnically minoritized supervisees with racially or ethnically minoritized supervisors. I've used these acronyms here just because it's a bit of a mouthful to keep saying it, so I will kind of continue to refer to this as I go through this. But in general, we had 4 different groups there, and we wanted to see if there were any differences that existed between these 4 groups. We also wanted to see what the relationship was like between cultural responsivity and supervision and the supervisory relationship, and whether higher levels of supervisor cultural responsivity would be associated with higher levels of satisfaction within the supervisory relationship. We also wanted to look at what predicted greater quality supervisory relationships for REM supervisees and white supervisees. So one of our main findings was really that there was a big difference between the experiences of supervisees from white backgrounds and supervisees from minoritized backgrounds. So we found that supervisees from racially or ethnically minoritized backgrounds who were in dyads with white supervisors reported significantly lower quality supervisory relationships. In particular, they felt less safe and they reported less structure in their supervision. We also found that they reported significantly less culturally responsive supervision. So they perceived their supervisor as less culturally competent and felt that they promoted supervisory cultural competence less. We also found that they experienced significantly more harmful culturally unresponsive supervision than white supervisees in dyads with white supervisors. In addition, when looking at the relationship between cultural responsivity and the supervisory relationship, we found that greater cultural responsivity and supervision significantly predicted higher quality supervisory relationships, and that was regardless of the supervisee's race or ethnicity. We also found that perceived cultural competence was a predictor of supervisory relationship quality for both white supervisees and REM supervisees. Additionally, for REM supervisees, we found that the development of cultural identity in supervision was really important. Also, fewer experiences of harmful culturally unresponsive practices was a significant predictor of supervisory relationship quality. REM supervisees also spoke about feeling that it was more important to talk about issues of race and ethnicity in supervision than white supervisees did. However, we found that they were less comfortable with raising sensitive issues related to race and ethnicity in supervision than white supervisors. So to sum that up, we found that REM supervisees perceived their white supervisors as less culturally responsive and experienced lower quality supervisory relationships than white supervisees did. We also found that REM supervisees experienced less safety in clinical supervision and more experiences of harmful culturally unresponsive supervision than white supervisees. We found that culturally responsive discussions in supervision may play a really important role in strengthening the supervisory relationship for supervisees, regardless of their cultural background. And we realized that further studies are required in this area to further investigate whether cultural identity development within supervisory relationships is beneficial. So that was the first part of the study. The second part of the study also captured qualitative data, and we asked participants about what they thought would improve culturally responsive supervisory practices. So we collected qualitative data from 131 supervisees, and we explored that qualitative data using thematic analysis and found 5 major themes, which I'll talk about in a minute. In general, it was proposed that the supervisor needs to initiate and lead cultural conversations safely and sensitively, particularly as supervisees may be at varying stages of their own cultural development. Supervisees also felt that supervisors needed to take more responsibility in developing their own personal and professional cultural identity due to the existing power dynamics that were inherent within the supervisory relationship. The findings also touched on the fact that training programs have a responsibility, as well as professional bodies, to think about how they integrate cultural responsivity into clinical training on a wider level. So in terms of the key themes that came from the data, supervisees spoke about the need to integrate race and ethnicity into the profession. So they spoke about normalizing this, making it a regular topic in supervision, with formal recognition of race and ethnicity in supervisory discussions. So by formal recognition, they referred to having it as part of, training curriculums, as part of guidance. So for example, guidance that comes from the BPS, and making sure that it was recognized by everybody within the profession. Another theme also referred to how important it was to attend to the supervisory relationship. So supervisees spoke about the fact that safety was so important in the supervisory relationship, and the emphasis on the supervisor's responsibility to initiate this process. They also spoke about the fact that openness in a supervisory relationship and self-disclosure was really key to developing that supervisory relationship. Supervisees also spoke about the need for increased cultural competence, so increasing resources and up-to-date training. They also spoke about the need for cultural exposure in and out of supervision. The fourth theme referred to addressing the power dynamic that exists within supervision. So all supervisees wanted the power dynamic to be addressed in supervision in order to improve the supervisory relationship. But minoritized supervisees in particular felt that it was important for supervisors to address the cultural power dynamics and prioritize safety in the supervisory relationship by displaying their cultural knowledge and competence. They felt that a good way for them to do this was in broaching some of those difficult conversations. So here's a direct quote, which says, for the supervisor to bring it up first and be willing to talk about their race and ethnicity from a white perspective, so it doesn't just fall to me as a non-white person to talk about it, which continues to other me. And finally, the final theme that came out from the qualitative data was cultural humility. So minoritized supervisees spoke about the supervisor's responsibility in building their own self-awareness and developing their own cultural competence. So some of the direct quotes that we've got here are: supervisors should think about their own development and learning and how they can learn from their trainee. They should be fostering communication and challenging their own selves to be able to deliver this and be competent to work with all people, which includes accounting for race. Be open to examining own biases and lack of knowledge and be willing to share that in supervision. White supervisees spoke about wanting to work with a more diverse range of clients and supervisors. And one direct quote that we have here is, I think my experience has been limited due to being white British and having only white British supervisors. This coupled with training in the Southwest and being exposed to a less diverse client base. So it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour because there was a lot of kind of data to talk about there. But in terms of the direct clinical implications, I guess the main things that I wanted to kind of invite everybody to think about today was the wider clinical implications of the findings. So really the importance of therapy training programs, professional bodies, supervisors and service leads, and ensuring that the development and prioritization of cultural responsive supervision continues. So really kind of thinking about, you know, how are we keeping some of these conversations going? Secondly, one of the kind of wider implications also includes thinking more about training and culturally responsive supervision training in particular, and thinking about how this is then evaluated and whether this could actually become an expectation of CPD for professional bodies, with the quality of these things being formally evaluated via accreditation pathways. We also kind of need to think a bit more about the development of culturally responsive supervision models, how to promote further research in the area, and critical evaluation of existing models which may contain inherent cultural biases. And finally, whiteness within services also needs to be spoken about and thought about. So, you know, how do we increase representation of clinicians from minoritized backgrounds? How do we provide them with additional support and safe spaces, particularly if they are experiencing more instances of harmful, culturally unresponsive supervision? So this leads me to the final part, and I guess the discussion about how we move forwards and how we start talking more about race and supervision. So with this, I've got the 5 elements of cultural competence here, which kind of talks about how we might start thinking about this from an individual level. So we can think about how we acknowledge cultural differences, how we begin to reflect on our own culture and our own journeys and identities, how we engage in that self-assessment work where we really examine our own assumptions and biases, how we acquire cultural knowledge and skills, and how we view behavior within a cultural context. So this is a model that currently exists. But I think when we talk about cultural competence, sometimes it can imply that there's an end point where you might kind of reach that cultural competence and that's it. And I think that can be problematic because we almost need to think of cultural responsivity as a journey with no fixed endpoint. So in terms of just some of my kind of initial thoughts about how we move forwards and how we take some of these research findings into clinical practice, I've just got a few points that I did want to share. So I think one of the first points is giving ourselves permission to talk about race and culture and supervision. I found personally, often toying with this and kind of thinking, can I talk about this in supervision? Are we supposed to talk about this in supervision? And I think sometimes I need to kind of check in with myself and remind myself that it is really important and it's relevant for me, it's relevant for my supervisor, but most importantly, it's relevant for the clients that I see. Secondly, I think it's important to remember that building that safe supervisory relationship takes time. It takes patience, compassion, and commitment from both parties. And safety can look different for everybody. Therefore, it's so important to create that safe space in a collaborative way, and discuss your differences and shared values with your supervisor. I think it's also important to remember that supervisors often hold a lot of power in supervision, and therefore, that comes with the responsibility to take the lead in broaching some of those difficult discussions around power and privilege. I think it's important to remember that cultural humility is an ongoing, lifelong commitment. It requires ongoing reflection and inquiry. It requires you to remain tentative, open, and curious, whilst remembering, again, that it's an ongoing process. There's not going to be a point where you can kind of say, okay, all is done now, it's finished, I've reached kind of cultural competence. It's a changing dynamic process. It may also be really helpful to speak to your supervisor about how to repair and attend to kind of getting things wrong in the supervisory relationship. And that can come, from the supervisor or the supervisee, but having a language around that or setting up some form of kind of contract to navigate that can be really powerful. I also wanted to mention relational risk taking, just because it's important that we aren't afraid to share those parts of our authentic self. With that can also mean referring to wider political issues that are relevant to you, your clients, and your professional self. I know for me in particular, there is a lot kind of going on in the world right now that I've just been really kind of chewing over. And I think to say that it doesn't affect your mental health, isn't always helpful. You can't always compartmentalize and separate things. I currently work in a children's service, and hearing about the current genocide in Palestine, I am constantly thinking about those children, how it affects my work, how I'm trying to kind of navigate that space within supervision. And sometimes there is that real fear of broaching that in supervision, just because I don't know how my supervisor is going to react. But I guess this point kind of just refers to the fact that it might be scary, but it's important to keep kind of pushing yourself and keep challenging yourself by kind of having those really difficult conversations. And I guess realizing the fact that, yeah, supervision can be that space where we bring some of those really difficult things that we've been toying with for further exploration and further examination. And finally, the last point talks about how important it is to keep seeking out training, keep kind of staying on top of current research in the area, and learning opportunities to develop skills further. So that brings me to the end of the presentation section. So I'll just stop sharing that now if we want to kind of start the question and answer section.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bianca, for sharing not only your research, but also some of your personal experience in terms of joining clinical psychology training community and ongoing work. Much appreciated. Really, really interesting work. We've got a couple of questions that have appeared in the Q&A. I'd encourage other people to add more as they're thinking of them. That would be great. And I know you started towards the end to talk a bit about this, but how would you sort of recommend that culture and race could be brought into the supervisory relationship? Any ideas or tips around that?
So I think sometimes that can start with the contracting phase. So I know that I can see that's what that person's mentioned. But sometimes kind of really spending the time at the beginning can be really helpful in kind of setting the scene and the foundation for further conversation and discussion along the line. Sometimes, it needs to kind of be the supervisor who is coming in and saying, look, there is a space for this here. This is really important. We do need to talk about this, regardless of our cultural backgrounds. And I think if we think about the fact that, most supervisory relationships in the UK are going to be white supervisees with white supervisors, it's important that that conversation is still continuing. And I think in terms of kind of how do you kind of include it and bring it up, I think it's important to remember that it takes both parties to really do that. It needs the supervisor to lead it, but it also needs the supervisee to kind of keep bringing things and kind of saying, oh, hang on, this has fallen off the agenda a little bit, or actually, I do want to kind of think about how my cultural identity affects this client. And it takes both parties to really be kind of committed to continuing that. So it's a bit of a tricky one, just because I think there isn't going to be a rule that kind of fits everybody. And I know, personally as well, there are some supervision sessions where it completely, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about theory, or I'm thinking about formulation. And I think it's just helpful to kind of, I guess, maybe have that agreement from both sides at the beginning that you'll both kind of keep each other in check, and you'll keep kind of adding it to the conversation.
So kind of contracting it in and then keeping it on that agenda. So yeah, keep coming back and focusing on it. Okay, thank you. I'm just jumping to one that says great presentation, Bianca. And were there any findings from your research, the qualitative research, which surprised you or were different from what you initially hypothesized?
I guess one of the main things that I thought was quite surprising was generally the conversation around cultural identity. So I think across the board, we found that it wasn't really spoken about that much. And I think that's the bit that really shocked me, because I thought, hang on a second, why? Like, surely when a person is kind of coming into supervision and you're starting out with someone, you'd want to kind of know influences, what drives that person, where they've learned, some of their patterns of behavior from. But I think across the board, it was almost as if it wasn't spoken about that much, which almost made me think, is that because it's not seen as a priority within clinical psychology? It's not given as much importance because the emphasis is more so on the client and, what are we doing to help the client, without realizing that we are often the vehicles that, are part of that process. We're also inputting into that through the way that we see the world. So I think that was probably one of the main kind of findings that I was a bit surprised by. But I think the rest of the findings did kind of fit with the findings that we'd seen from the research that came out of America and other parts of the world.
Thank you. There's a lot more questions flowing in, so I might ask some other people to jump in and ask them as well. One that I've spotted here was about someone who's saying about how validating it was as well as a trainee, to hear the stuff that you were kind of talking about. And they've got a question about whether you would have any advice, I don't know if this came out of the research or from your own reflections, on how to navigate as a trainee if a supervisor is not explicitly mentioning I guess race or ethnicity, because I think this person, they've had assumptions made from supervisors, such as whether they might struggle with things due to their accent around English, not having it as a first language, for example. So do you have any tips around that?
Gosh, well, I think the first thing to say is, gosh, that sounds really challenging. And it's so difficult with training, just because sometimes, supervisors had so many trainees on placement. Sometimes they've got a set way of, well, this is how the placement's done. And actually that can be really difficult if you're coming in from a different way of looking at things, and actually you don't fit that mold, I guess. In the past, what has helped me is revisiting things. So I remember with one supervisor, I tried to bring something up and it didn't quite land. And it felt like my supervisor really just wasn't hearing me and kind of missed the point. And I left feeling quite annoyed and frustrated and thinking, oh, I'm just not gonna say anything. I'm just gonna leave it, and I'm just gonna get through this placement. And I guess kind of after checking in with myself, taking some time to kind of calm myself down, I thought about the fact that actually, look, we're having supervision every week. Let's keep bringing it back, and let's keep bringing it back until we're having that conversation that we need to be having. It wasn't easy to do. The second time I brought it up, it was still tough to try to explain things, but the space in between supervision meant that I could kind of go away, have a think about some of the examples that I couldn't come up with the first time round, and come back to some of those points. I think the other thing that really helped me was going in with some tools. So sometimes, there are lots of kind of different, research papers. There's a lot of different guidance that exists. So I think Leeds University has got some guidance for supervisors. And it's really difficult because, going in and saying, well, here's the guidance and you're the supervisor who's in that position of power, but I want you to read this is really tough. But I think it can be done in a helpful way, and in a way where you're kind of saying, look, this is what I need from you as my supervisor, and this is what I'm missing, that I really think if you were to read this paper, you might kind of understand a little bit more of. But I guess just kind of having those tools to help kind of explain your points. And don't get me wrong, that's not easy, because sometimes you kind of do feel like, hang on a second, why doesn't my supervisor know that already? Why am I having to explain things to them? But I always think, with supervision, it's mutual learning. Your supervisor isn't going to know everything. When it comes to you and your experiences, you are the expert. So it's important to kind of, come back and kind of articulate that in a way that you can. And if you can't, just keep coming back to it, because it needs to be a two-way street, and your supervisor should really be helping you to develop that voice and understand that.
Thanks, Bianca.
I was going to come in a little bit, if that's okay, Jen.
Yeah.
Just to reflect, maybe bring Annie in as well. Just I think as a white supervisor, maybe it's sometimes being prepared to get it wrong, and maybe it's going to be clunky sometimes, perhaps because we don't do enough of it, that we need to sort of be prepared to be clunky, let's say. Like Annie, what was it like for you when you were an assistant psychologist in our team and people bringing stuff up? Was it all...
Thanks. So do you mean like the time you kind of just asked me out of the blue, kind of, have you ever experienced racism?
Yeah, what was that like? Was it
Shocking, actually. I think I reflect on this a lot, and I think as you know, a white male supervisor, I was quite shocked to be asked that question, and I really had to think about how I was going to respond to that. And I think what you were saying, Bianca, about it was definitely a two-way thing. So I had to accept that this was something that I have to push myself to do, and that was difficult, but I think it was helpful that Rufus was genuinely interested in my experiences, and that safety was there. So that was important, but he didn't, the way he asked it, it was in a way that showed curiosity and that he really wanted to know. And I think that really helped me open up. And I think that's kind of how these conversations are now going. So that was a really important mark for me as an assistant psychologist, to have someone like that ask me that question. Although, of course, I've experienced racism, but it was nice that he was kind of there he was just genuinely interested. Definitely.
It must be hard, because sometimes as trainees or assistants, you know, training in psychology, that there's a big pressure to appear competent, and then, you know, to talk about your experience of hardship might be quite like difficult sometimes, but maybe there's a sense of you've got to be this competent clinician, and then your role models might be being quite expert like. So where's the space to talk about if experiences of adversity, so like racism? It feels like, yeah. Would you answer that question differently now?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think because I'm more confident, I would definitely answer it differently. There was definite power in that dynamic, but
yeah,
I guess the way you navigated it also made a difference. So that was helpful. And I think the way Kate, who was my other supervisor, she kind of was also interested in these conversations. So it became a thing that we discussed regularly and we reflected on as a team. And that was really important in me kind of being able to be more confident, maybe challenging things that weren't okay for me. And kind of like we were saying, it's not a cultural competence, it's a learning together. And even I'm learning things as well. So it's quite, that dynamic has really kind of brought us together. So that's quite important too.
Yeah, Bianca, your presentation was making me think about, I won't speak much longer, but your was making you think about the problem with the term supervision, because it's like overseeing something, you know. And I've heard about this concept of intervision, where you kind of, it's more, I guess, acknowledged in the word that there's some equality and you might be co-learning and learning from each other. I wonder if that puts a lot of pressure on both parties, that kind of concept.
Yeah, and I think that kind of really speaks to some of the fear and the anxiety that can come from supervisors when they feel like, oh gosh, I am supposed to be the expert here. Am I supposed to know all of these things? And you know, I can really see how difficult that might then be. So yeah, I really like what you said there of actually changing that language and kind of balancing out that power a little bit.
We should go back to the questions. One more question for you, Bianca. How did it affect you doing this research? Was it painful? Was it empowering? Was it all of the above?
It felt really empowering when I was doing it, because it felt like after kind of experiencing what I did, like there wasn't always a solution that I was the most happy with when I kind of spoke to kind of people at the university about it. And it felt like kind of doing the research was a way of kind of saying, look, I'm not kind of alone in this, where sometimes it really felt like I was, just because I didn't have another person in my cohort that I could kind of turn to and be like, did I imagine that? Did I not? Am I overreacting? Am I not? I don't know. And kind of coming into the research, looking at the papers that already existed, and some of the things that had been written, I just felt like, oh gosh, there is so much power in this. There are so many people who are experiencing similar things. There's a language that I now have to kind of, go back and kind of explain some of the things that I'm experiencing. So, thinking about how I then took that and showed that, with, kind of spoke about that in supervision was really helpful for me. And I think even now, as a clinician, I do kind of go back to some of those research papers when I am thinking about refreshing my knowledge, or I am thinking about, how do I phrase what I want to phrase in a helpful way. So yeah, I found it really empowering.
Okay. I don't know if I want to be. Mika had a question. Mika, do you want to come on and ask the question, or shall I read it out? I don't know if she's able to. She says, "So interesting, Bianca, thank you. I just completed a systematic review in the same topic, but in low and middle income countries. And interestingly, my themes are similar." She's wondering if your results are published, I think.
Yes, they are. So the qualitative paper and the quantitative paper are two different ones that have been published. So I can send over the links to you, Rufus, if you want to kind of send them out.
Right. Somebody asked, what do you think about using Maria Harmans asked, what do you think about using the power threat meaning framework for keeping race prominent in formulations?
I think that's brilliant. I think that's a great way of kind of saying, rather than, tell me that kind of exact experience, it's the thing of what are the experience, what's happened to you, how has that shaped you? And it's kind of putting things into a cultural context, which I think can be really, really powerful, especially when you are working with clients as well, and you're thinking about, how their experiences have informed some of the difficulties that they're presenting with.
Does somebody else want to ask a question, or shall I? I've got one more, and then I'll.
Go for your one more.
Yeah, I'll do one more. Somebody's asking, I really want to be able to raise race and ethnicity as a soon-to-be supervisor, and I really worry about doing it with new assistant psychologists who haven't had chance to get used to how supervision works yet. Do you have any thoughts about how early to do this when people are new to the profession, and whether you do anything differently or not?
So that's a really good question. I think one of the findings from the research spoke about self-disclosure in supervision, and the fact that actually maybe the supervisor could broach the subject by talking about themselves, talking about their own kind of intersectionality and, power and privileges, and use that as a way of kind of saying, look, here's some of the things that I've reflected on, that I want to share with you, as a way of kind of opening up this subject area. And sometimes, that might come from, unpacking some of their own cultural identity, or even kind of saying, here's my journey in terms of my cultural identity development, and here are the things that I've learned along the way. There are also other tools that have been mentioned in the literature. So things such as the social graces, kind of going through that as a bit of an exercise and kind of taking it in turns together, or the salient circles exercise, where you kind of draw out your own circles and invite the other person to do the same. And really, I guess, kind of normalizing that conversation about the fact that, our culture is going to permeate into the way that we see the world, our values, our beliefs, and maybe sometimes even kind of leaning on some of that literature and theoretical knowledge to kind of explain why it is so important in the first instance.
Yeah. I was thinking it is important, like you say, for white people as well, to reflect on culture. Like one of our assistant psychologists from the Isle of Wight, and it's quite got its own distinct culture to in lots of conversations we've had, there's more a sense of community there than there is in some parts, and there's more of a, there's some really interesting things that have happened on the Isle of Wight. Like David Icke was supported to have his views, very different views on the Isle of Wight. The community rallied around him rather than said this guy's crazy. But it's led to some interesting discussions thinking about communities within English culture being different. Different classes, of course, there's going to be different cultures there that we need to talk about too, I think. Right, back to the questions.
So there's a question asking about what next, really. So what areas of like further inquiry have been highlighted from your research, Bianca? What would you like to look into in the future, or have someone else look into?
I think one of the real difficulties with supervision research is, first of all, defining clinical supervision, but also creating reliable ways of measuring the phenomena that we're looking at. So I guess one of the things that I think is really important is, how do we create measures to use in supervision? So things that supervisees and supervisors can use to kind of track the conversation and the helpfulness of the conversation, and give that feedback in a meaningful way. I think there is definitely something about clinical supervision and how that links to practice. So, is kind of talking about culture in clinical supervision directly helping clients? And how can we start to kind of measure that? Because I think sometimes it's that link between supervision and actual clinical practice is a bit, really hard to measure, actually, and really difficult to kind of say, well, this is directly linked to that. But it would be really, helpful to kind of look into that a little bit more. And also just to think about the helpfulness of cultural identity development, and whether that is something that needs to be a bit more explicit in supervision, especially when we're talking about race and culture, because it's the thing of, actually, this is, this specifically has a space here, and it's a specific part of kind of training where we do want everybody who's coming into the profession to be thinking about their own journey, regardless of their cultural background.
Absolutely. Thank you. You mentioned as part of the research a measure, was it the initials RESS?
Yes, so it's the RES, so it's the Race and Ethnicity Supervision Scale. So it was created in America, and it was created because a lot of the current measures looked at multicultural supervision, and culture is such an umbrella term that it can involve so many different aspects of culture. So this was specifically looking at race and ethnicity, but it looked at certain parts of developing cultural competence in supervision, how the supervisor promoted that, and how the supervisee kind of perceived that to be happening in supervision. So it was a really kind of specific measure that we thought would be really helpful to kind of bring across the UK, just to see, kind of how did that match the experience of UK supervisees.
Interesting. I wonder if that could be used within supervision as a tool to sort of stimulate conversation between supervisor and supervisee. Thank you. There's a question about how you think clinical psychology courses could help supervisors and trainees talk about race. If you've got any, I know you've mentioned that a bit, but any more specific ideas around that?
I think personally, I would kind of just say by leading the way, by making sure that it isn't just, a 2-day training or, a tick box thing. It's kind of embedded throughout the curriculum, throughout kind of lectures and conversations. I also think there's a real importance in how we train supervisors as well. So usually most university courses will kind of run their own supervisor training. And I think within that, it can be really important to kind of, speak more about race and ethnicity, but also think about how it's tracked and evaluated along the way. So, could there be a forum where clinical supervisors can come back and say, I'm really stuck with this question, or, it's almost like supervision of supervision, but having a safe space to do that. And I guess coming at it from the viewpoint of that we don't, no one has the exact answers, but we're trying to kind of navigate this together, and we're keeping it on the agenda. So it isn't just something that we're like, okay, oh, hang on, we've got to tick that off, and we've got to make sure that we do that. It's important, and it's seen as important by everybody there. I also think one of the things that I found particularly challenging when I was training was the fact that, like I said, there was only one person of color within the program team. And I found that that person then became my supervisor. All the questions about race and things like that were directed towards that member of staff. And I think it's really important to kind of remember that, everybody has a culture and a race, and it can't be a concept that's just reserved for minoritized groups. It needs to be a conversation that everybody is having.
Thanks, Bianca. So we've got a lot of questions. I'm just scrolling through them.
Yeah, there was one about, I think it's about that getting it wrong thing. That was, how do we help people think about their cultural identity? There's sometimes been a lack of interest in thinking about this, despite inviting the conversation. I wonder how to do it in a more scaffolded way. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like a narrative therapy idea. Perhaps it's about modeling a little more. After listening to you today, I also fear that someone could feel reduced to their differences. And so the invitation is there, but it sometimes feels hard to keep making the space without worrying about focusing too much on something that isn't being taken up by others. Perhaps listening to you all speak, there needs to be less fear of getting it wrong from me, though. So I guess, maybe it's like whenever there's a question about race or culture, I turn to Annie and say, what do you think, Annie? That's the kind of thing they're getting at, that we don't want to be like reducing people to cultural experts, but then somehow putting pressure, that puts a lot of pressure and reduces their identity rather than expands our relationships.
Yeah, I think that comes with cultural humility. I think it comes from that kind of viewpoint of saying, this and that, like, it's not going to be, okay, this person, just because they're from a minoritized background, is going to be the expert on all things. However, they are going to be the expert of their own experiences and their own life. And I guess it's kind of just making sure that the two are balanced. So, if there is something about kind of race or things like that, and Ruth, as you kind of said, you might then kind of say, Annie, do you want to answer that first? It might be that you kind of say, actually, this is what my thoughts are, and Annie, I'm also interested to hear your thoughts, and kind of have the two together. I know personally, for me, one of the things that I found really tricky was when those discussions were part of like a wider kind of cohort discussion, sometimes as a visiting lecturers would kind of say, Bianca, what do you think about that? And I'd kind of be like, what? But you're singling me out. And I understood that it was coming from a place of I want to give you that voice. But I then had to explain, but I have a voice, and I can use my voice kind of here, like, you know, however I want to use it. I don't need, like, by kind of taking that choice away from me, you kind of added to the issue there. And I can see how that would be different for, you know, different people, but I think there is something about just kind of coming with cultural humility and saying that, look, this is a safe space where we're all learning. We're not gonna kind of get it all right, and at the same time, you know, if we're not getting it all right, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's wrong. Let's talk about, you know, what's not sounding okay or sounding uncomfortable to hear. And let's revisit that and talk about how that feels.
Yeah. Mm. Mm. Would anybody like to ask a question live? Come on the mic and ask a question. You could raise a hand if you want to do it that way, or you're welcome to. We wanted to give that space near the end as well. Has this question been asked? Could you specify which countries were categorized under racial and ethnic minority in your study?
So we did use a UK sample, so there wasn't any specific kind of countries that we'd kind of said. We just said, you know, how do you identify? And if you identify as belonging to racially or ethnically minoritized group, then specify.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll send out links to the papers. Somebody says, I'd be interested in hearing how a white male or female supervisor could curiously inquire about Annie's experiences of racism that would feel less intrusive or difficult. There's an implication that what I did was very difficult, but that's okay. Yeah, Annie, over to you.
Oh, Rufus. Oh. No, I think what you were saying, Bianca, about sort of salient circles and social graces is a nice way to bring it in. And I think it's I think, yeah, like you're saying, just both sharing that everyone kind of has culture and their own kind of experiences, and that just really helps make it a nice safe space to do that.
I think I might have written something about racism and mental health and shared it with you before I had that conversation.
Oh yeah, you might have, yeah.
So it might have been like a bit of a warm-up. But it might not have been on the same day. But yeah, and I think sometimes, I guess, conversations are difficult, and that's okay too, as long as they're, you know, with warmth and compassion, and humility, as you say, like, but yeah.
And there's a question of difficult conversations as well here, actually asking about if you've ever felt it kind of wasn't worth because of the 6 months long placement set up in training where people are kind of moved on quite quickly, if there'd ever be an argument for trying not to have those difficult kind of conversations because you kind of be moved somewhere. Don't know what your thoughts are on that, Bianca.
I think it's really tough, just because I think everybody's so different. For me, I really kind of saw it as this thing of, no, we're having that conversation because we need to have that conversation. And it was always clunky and I didn't know how to have that conversation, but I would try anyway. And sometimes, you know, I'd have a supervisor who would kind of just look at me and I feel like they they weren't getting it, and I kept bringing it back, and there were points where I was just like, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? But then I left that thinking, do you know what, now when that supervisor has another trainee, it's going to be on their mind, because it's been kind of brought up, they've been pulled out on some of their language, or they've been told that, you know, that didn't work. And I think sometimes it's kind of, it just comes to kind of the balance of all those other things that you're having to do whilst training, and how much you feel yourself that you can kind of put that fight on, really. For some people, they might turn around and say, do you know what, I'm not going there, I've had that conversation too many times, and it's not my job to kind of have to educate that person. And I think it just comes back to kind of your own personal resources, and what feels comfortable for you and what doesn't.
I think, I mean, I didn't, you know, obviously I have you know, white English background, but I had my personal experience of being treated in the psychiatric system, and I found it really hard to find a place to reflect on personal experience in clinical psychology. I felt that a lot of lecturers in the course weren't reflecting on their own experience, and then maybe it was better in supervision, but it felt like personal experience was a bit devalued in the profession. And perhaps because we had to be scientific, and we were trained to, you know, write in the third person rather than write from the I. So I wonder then if it's sometimes then difficult to bring in that it's called lived experience now, you know, that personal wisdom that we all have, and have those kind of, I wonder if that's another barrier as well. But hopefully, you know, there's an emphasis on being reflective, isn't there? The reflective practitioner, and but please, if anybody disagrees with me, please come in. But yeah, that because I was been thinking about your question, why, you know, why does my supervisor not talk with me about race? And is there, you know, is there something about being difficult to talk about personal experience as well as culture in the profession? I don't know. What do other people think?
I think that's a really interesting idea. The idea, like, somehow there's a message that as a supervisor, you've got to be something other than able to share of yourself, or do, yeah, you will give less of yourself. You're there to hear more about the person you're supervising, like in kind of almost a reflection of the therapy type model, you know, you're there to kind of hear more about the person accessing therapy. Whereas actually, as I really like that word you were saying, like intervision, was it, Rufus? Like actually that's the reality, isn't it? Power sits with one person, but it's the relationship that makes things move, both in therapy and supervision, which is right back to where you started, wasn't it, Bianca? Actually, it's both parties being able to reflect on themselves. But that's my view, I think. Yeah.
Oh. Somebody's asked a question, what is it you think the global majority need to understand about the white race when discussing race in supervision?
That's a big question.
I wonder if they've got a view they could share as well. But yeah, it's a big question.
Think I'm trying to kind of think about how to go about answering that, but I don't know if I can kind of put it in a succinct way. I think there's a lot there about having to understand history and kind of oppression and power and privilege, and I guess the kind of formation of different racial categories in the first instance, and the fact that actually, you know, when we're talking about race, it is a social construct, and yeah, I think that can sometimes be the most powerful point, that actually when we talk about minoritized groups, you know, that's a social process, you know, that has been done too, and that's come from somewhere. So I think there's a lot there about, yeah, the history that's important to kind of understand.
Yeah, I think what being part of Let's Face Change and has really helped me just want to just keep learning more and keep reading different accounts, historical and different cultural accounts of whether it's mental health or life, you know, and look into understanding different perspectives on colonialism. So yeah, it's makes me realize how much there is to find out and reflect on that I wouldn't have learned in school or university.
And the ongoing nature of that kind of learning, like you say, before, like being a journey rather than a destination. This, yeah.
There's a question here about Bianca, sort of about any advice in terms of your research findings about how to not make talking about culture, and you might, I think you probably have answered this as well, how to not make it more of a tick box exercise within the supervisor relationship, but kind of make it a bit more meaningful. And I think kind of speaks maybe to what you were saying then, Rufus and Jen, but yeah. Any advice on the supervisor on how to do that?
I guess I would really be thinking about how do you take that step back? What's the wider context? And can we understand everybody within their cultural context? So, you know, if a supervisee is bringing a client to supervision, and they're talking about their, you know, presenting kind of mental health problem, trying to kind of formulate some of those difficulties, I think, you know, taking a step back and maybe kind of, you know, looking at tools like social graces and thinking about, okay, if we were to apply this to this particular client, you know, let's have a think, like, you know, if they are from a white British background, how does that impact how they're viewing their problem, how they're seeing the world at the moment? What's the intersectionality there? I know, Rufus, you talked a bit about kind of class and geography and things like that, and, you know, how does that also fit into how we're formulating that problem? And I guess almost kind of making sure that we've got that kind of cultural oversight on any formulations that we are talking about in supervision, and also kind of thinking about how we then check that out with clients in a helpful and safe way to kind of make sure that we've got their feedback into the process, and we're not making assumptions there about that client.
Questions just popped up when I was saying, aside from your papers, which the person very much look forward to reading, which one key text would you wish that white supervisors would read?
So hard. I'm not too sure. I think one of the really kind of influential researchers in the area for me was Namisha Patel in the UK. I think she really kind of started this conversation a while back, really thinking about, you know, how some of the kind of unhelpful culturally unresponsive practices are perpetuated within the profession, and really talking about kind of yeah, what's helpful and what's not. And so I think there's quite a few papers that she's written in the area, but I would definitely kind of turn to that as a starting point.
In terms of that, there's a few questions about links to the Leeds, where is it gone? To the resources mentioned for supervisors from Leeds University as well, and links to the, and sharing your slides as well, just if that's.
Yeah, that's not a problem. I can send that to you, Rufus.
Okay.
So are you supervising anyone at the moment, Bianca?
Yes, I am. And yeah, I think it's, even now for me, I really struggle sometimes with kind of thinking about how I broach the subject, and making sure that we're kind of keeping the conversation alive in supervision, because I think especially in the NHS, it can become so difficult when you're thinking about waiting lists and time, and you're trying to kind of get through everybody. And sometimes you're like, well, we don't have time to really sit and think. And I think sometimes it's just about kind of making sure we create the space for that, and keep that conversation alive.
It makes me think about, there's so many areas in our lives where the views can be quite polarized, and how we can keep spaces open to different perspectives, whether it's about the environment or about, medicine or society's approach to COVID or religion. There are all these things that can be gender, identity. There's so many things, and it's how do we create supervision where we're not dominating with our views or our perspectives, even however enlightened we might think they are, but creating space for different perspectives. And
I really like the DBT model when it comes to thinking about that a little bit more. And I
Right.
kind of think about the fact that, yeah, there are multiple truths and they can all exist at the same time. And you sharing your truth doesn't mean that anybody else's truth is, less valid. And it's almost kind of just saying, well, that's what we're here for. Let's carry on talking. And as, psychology practitioners, we're understanding that there's never just going to be one way of looking at things. We're all going to have a unique take on it, and that's diversity. That's the great thing about having these conversations, that you're constantly seeing and understanding different people and their viewpoints.
So, Annie, do you want to close the?
No, well, I guess just to say thank you to you, Bianca. That was a really great talk and a lot of important things to talk about. I think from the questions, people really got a lot of value from it. Yeah, it was great. Anyone else? Rufus, go on.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like inspired to, keep working on this, and think about how we in our team meetings can mention more, give more space to thinking about culture and race, or racialized behaviors, or differences, and people's experiences of that, and culturally different perspectives. Jen, you want to say last?
Yeah, again, thank you so much, Bianca. I kind of feel really inspired as well by what you said, and encouraged to keep thinking about this in supervisory settings and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.